Boy, something feels a little different about this review now, doesn't it? I can't quite put my finger on it, and I don't think you'll be able to put your finger on it either, but there is something a little bit different about this video. It's very subtle, and again, you probably won't be able to pick up on it, but there is indeed something different about this video, and trust me, this difference is here to stay for the rest of my channel's history, or however long it goes on for. But again, it's something you shouldn't notice, so there's nothing to really gripe about. Yeah. Final Fantasy has firmly cemented itself as one of the biggest franchises in video game history, let alone JRPG history, but that has been reiterated time and time again by many, including myself, so there's no need to further reiterate the fact. However, what I will say is that in its near 4-decade history, there have been an abundance of classic titles that fans and critics alike both look back on with fondness. The average Final Fantasy fan, diehard or not, can at least somewhat detail a few of its entries. Many will refer to the high fantasy setting of 9, the main theme song from 10, and shit, Cloud Strife is, without a doubt, one of the most recognizable characters in fiction. Like, I'm pretty sure my grandpa would be able to recognize him. But sadly, not every entry can be so lucky to have such a high reputation and level of familiarity amongst regular people and gamers, of course. With the franchise spanning 16 major titles, that's not including spin-offs by the way, there's bound to be at least one entry or two left away to rot within the confines of time. And throughout the Nintendo era of Final Fantasy, that statement rings pretty damn true. I mean, not many people are going to go out of their way and say, hey, let's play Final Fantasy 2 or 3. Who the fuck has ever told you that? No one. But it was when Final Fantasy VII came out where the franchise really found itself in the hearts of many outside of Japan and, well, just across the goddamn world. And since then, every single entry has been hit with a similar level of reputation, whether it be good or bad. All except for one single title, Final Fantasy XII, the subject of today's video, SA. Final Fantasy XII is, without a doubt, the most unrecognized entry in the entire series. 3D entry, to be precise. That's not including the pixel games that I mentioned earlier, because, again, nobody fucking plays FF2 anymore. It doesn't have the same iconic status as games like 7, 9, 10, and of course, it's not even as divisive as, let's say, 8 or 13. The Final Fantasy XII is just straight up ignored. Like, nobody even talks about this game. Even my friends, who are all diehard Final Fantasy fans, none of them, to my knowledge, have even touched Final Fantasy XII. And that's quite a shame. I hate that this game has been gotten so maligned over the years and so sidelined. It's bullshit, man. It's got some merits. It's got some problems, but it's definitely an enjoyable game, one that you should fucking play if you're a Final Fantasy fan. I don't know why none of you have. And of those people, myself, I'm including myself amongst those people, or at least I was one of those people way back when. Like, even when starting this game for the first time, I knew absolutely dick about it. It was the first Final Fantasy game I played where I knew absolutely nothing about it. I was going in completely blind. Like, completely. Even with games like 9, there were at least like something I knew about it. Like, I knew the game was kind of slow, and I know who Vivi was through Kingdom Hearts, but FF12? No, I knew nothing, man. I didn't know shit. And going in for the first time, I was asking myself those very same questions. Like, why does nobody play this game? I mean, it's one of the best-selling games in the franchise, right? Like, why does nobody play this fucking game? And then I played it for myself, and quickly I figured out the reason for this game's reputation. Final Fantasy XII is fucking weird. I can already hear the sounds of everyone flipping through their galleries looking for that "you had us in the first half" meme, but fear not, because Snakes in Alaska does indeed think that Final Fantasy XII is a good game. A great game, even if I'm feeling generous, and it's a good day. And the reason for this game's status as being the most ignored title is not hard to figure out why once you actually delve into it for yourselves. Final Fantasy XII has a wide number of ideas that are very experimental and very unique for the franchise, especially when it first came out back in 2006. And thus, the game did not sit well with fans. They were expecting something very different, to say the least, and thus, the game has been left to shrivel up into cobwebs and dust, and that's sad. And again, it's not like any of its ideas are particularly bad. They're just not what fans had grown accustomed to, nor what they were expecting. Okay, some of its ideas were bad, but I digress. Final Fantasy XII had a lot of ideas, both mechanically and narratively, that were significantly more experimental than that of its predecessors. I did mention that the story was a lot different than your typical archetypal Final Fantasy, but it's the gameplay mechanics that make it stand out the most. Even in a franchise that is constantly evolving or just outright changing its framework with each passing title, Final Fantasy XII still takes the cake for having the most out-of-left-field shakeup to the game's system, hands down. Even with all the mumbo-jumbo about materia and espers and junctioning and sphere grids and all that shit, every Final Fantasy game up until that point was, at its core, a traditional JRPG. That all changed with FF12. Instead, 12 opted for a quasi-MMO approach, featuring a real-time battle system defined by a mechanic known as Gambits. We'll get into that a little bit later, but for now, I'd like to talk about how combat in this game actually feels. Listen, I'm not going to beat around the bush or anything. Final Fantasy XII is a very, very slow game. Painfully slow, if I might add. If you haven't played it yet but are planning to, let me be the first to tell you that much of your playtime will be spent with the time multiplier enabled. That was not a demand. That was not even a suggestion. That was a cold, hard fucking fact. When you play this game, if you're playing the Zodiac Age version, which I very much highly recommend you fucking do, by the way, you will be using the time multiplier. It is a straight up fact you will be using, because god fucking damn, it's a lifesaver. This game is agonizingly slow without it. I fear for the poor little souls who had to play this game all the way back on the PS2. Like, damn. That's all I can say is just, damn. Sucks to be you. Final Fantasy XII has rather interesting gameplay concepts that show a ton of merit, but they ended up getting badly crushed under the weight of the game's severe pacing issues. First, let me make one thing very crystal clear. I wouldn't go so far as to say this game plays itself, because the gambits you set up for your characters is indeed playing the fucking game. There's also a bit of micromanaging you'll have to do in order to get by, on top of ensuring you have an optimal gambit set for each of your party members. So the notion that this game plays itself is pretty fucking ridiculous. And it just shows that you don't really have a clue what you're talking about. However, Final Fantasy XII constantly ran into this issue where the game simply felt too slow. The ATB gauges fill at a relatively modest speed, but the problems lie within how, again, slow the animations for the commands are, how slow everybody moves, just how completely weightless everything looks and feels. I'm not asking for the most epic and bombastic and cinematic battles, like, no, we don't need that every single game. We don't need a whole pan and shot of the landscape and like everyone dancing at the end and an experience screen at the end for every single fight, because that gets tiring, and it's kind of part of the reason why grinding can feel so tedious in an RPG, because much of the battles is devoted to like watching the animations and shit. But goddamn, could we at least have something a little more snappy, a little more fluid, something that's a little more entertaining to look at, other than this mess? No, I guess not. And to add insult to injury, they stretch the dungeons really fucking thin. They stretch like everything combat-wise very fucking thin. I'll go into further detail once I discuss the game's world design, but trust me, you'll really start to feel the fatigue kick in once you run around an area for like 10 minutes and see all the different mob types it has to offer. Hence the necessity to use the time multipliers. again, you will use them. I know I emulated FF10 for my review of that game, but again, you could not pay me to play the PS2 version of this game. No time multipliers, an allegedly worse progression system, and RNG chests. Yeah, I'll stick with remaster this time around, thank you very much. Getting back on track here, everything I had just mentioned does not deprive FF12's battle system of its finer qualities, of which there are several. Sure, it's painfully slow and just looks bland as all hell, but there's also quite a bit to enjoy here. Side note, the real reason why you should use the time multipliers is because it makes battles look like this. You ever seen that meme video of like all the fish like eating that dead fish carcass, all the hagfish eating the dead fish carcass? That's basically what this is. It's very entertaining and I love watching it. It looks so fucking frantic. But anyway, getting back to what I was supposed to be talking about. I really admire the level of interactivity here. Within your first few hours of playing, you may feel disappointed over the lack of those grand cinematic battles of previous entries, with pan-in shots, triumphant music, and everyone standing in a neatly organized manner. Hell, I missed them too. But it didn't take long for me to recognize the surprisingly nuanced factors there were to this system, and how you're able to engage with it. Given that most battles take place in an open, interconnected area with no interruptions, any party member can take on any enemy and vice versa, so as long as they're in with range. This poses an element of strategy to it, as you want to keep the inhabited monsters in check and deal with them quickly to prevent any others from joining in on the fun. It's not a particularly do or die deal, but with all the areas being as big as they are, it'll be wise to space out your battles in order to minimize the amount of MP you go through. You're managing when and how you engage in battle, on top of managing your resources. And I mean, duh, the same thing can be said for literally any other RPG on the planet. And to that I say, true, but I don't know, the element felt a little more tangible in this game. I don't know if I can explain it. Maybe it's because the areas are, again, so much bigger and there's a lot more distance between checkpoints than in any other game. But that's just me, I guess. Probably. I hope not. Anyway, one thing that is a do or die deal, however, are these, I'll call them super enemies that appear in certain areas. They'll sport a green health gauge, meaning that while they are friendly at first, if you so much as perform a dispel on them, it instantly becomes anyone's game. And chances are that flying little snowball you decided to pick a fight with is going to emerge victorious because it's going to kick your shit in real fucking quick. This is where the spacing out enemies angle comes into play the most, especially if a character is using an any gambit. Because if you are not careful, you will get your shit kicked in. They're usually viewed as a hazard, but one could view them as the ultimate test of everything you've learned up until that point. And I say one and not me because I do not have the skill level to take on those guys. No, I don't. Not yet, at least. This new real-time battle system also changed the way your party functions as well. You can swap around party members at almost any time, and you only get a game over if all 6 of them are down for the count. This is a great addition because it allows for more agency in how you can adapt to certain situations, especially when you consider the varying stats, affinities, and weaknesses the mobs of an area will have, not to mention bosses. On the flip side, however, let's just say that this party system is, for lack of a better word, imperfect. Changing your party's leader, for instance, feels weirdly obtuse. You have to deselect your entire party, then the first character you select is your leader. On top of that, KO'd members will have to be deselected if you wish to replace them during battle. And if you wind up somehow accidentally, or not accidentally, sticking the lead and role onto a guest party member, you're stuck playing as him as the leader until you get KO'd. I know this is nitpick of this fucking century, and it probably doesn't even matter to like 99% of the people who play them. But I just wish they could have implemented a much more intuitive way around this issue. Like, I don't know, push this button to assign lead and role, I guess, something like that. But enough about personal gripes that are innocuous in the grand scheme of things. Let's now delve into the real meat of Final Fantasy XII's gameplay, and that is the gambit system and the license board. If you've played a Final Fantasy game before, then you likely know what to expect in terms of abilities and shit. You have your usual Furagas, your Shells, your Bios, and newcomers such as Bleed, Balance, and a host of other abilities known as Technics. Yes, Technics is spelled like that. I don't know why. It's a cool spelling though, I will give him that. But of course, on the surface, this is just rudimentary, ordinary stuff. It's the method of obtaining these abilities that makes Final Fantasy XII's progression system stand out. Final Fantasy XII uses what's called a license board. It functions similarly to FF10's Sphere Grid, except in this case, you're not learning new abilities, you're acquiring the license to learn new abilities. I have very conflicting thoughts on this system, to the point where I'm genuinely struggling to articulate said thoughts. And I don't think you can blame me. It's a very strange, some would say obtuse system. It does sport a ton of agency and customization, but on the flip side, it feels needlessly grindy. After all, you not only have to spend license points in order to learn new abilities, you also have to find them or purchase them in shops. And it goes just beyond abilities too. Weapons, armor, accessories, gambits, you have to buy all of them or find them on top of needing the required license points to even unlock them to begin with. If you think this sounds a little bit stingy, well, you would be correct. Why not toss a player a little freebie when unlocking an accessory board, for instance? Give them a basic piece of equipment of that rank, while keeping the real good stuff with affinities and shit, locked away in shops and side quests. That way I won't feel like I have to constantly fight tooth and nail just to upgrade my equipment on a consistent basis. Having said all that though, the license board and remaster exclusive job system offers some of the most player freedom of expression of any Final Fantasy game. I mean that too. It's so good in that regard that I'm almost willing to forgive its grindy ass nature. Almost. You can move about it with even less restrictions in the Sphere Grid, on top of being able to see what's ahead of you, so you have a good idea of where you want to go, and you get to plan out where you want to go. Like, here's this board for an ability I want to unlock. Let me prioritize getting over there. You can do that in this one. There's like no restrictions. It's not as linear as a Sphere Grid. There's, again, no restrictions. Aside from the basic shit, obviously. On top of all that, unlocking a single space can give way to multiple others. You aren't stuck within the confines of a single pathway most of the time, so on and so forth. With this in mind, you also have the option to prioritize what sort of build you want to have with each character. You can primarily focus on getting the best equipment, learning all the job's abilities quickly, or giving them insane amounts of physical strength or magic potency. If you have a specific vision for what playstyle you want that character to undergo, by all means, go for it. Just keep it in the back of your mind that you'll need a lot of license points and gil to spare because, again, this shit does not come easy, and you will need to work your ass off for it. And on that note, gil is pretty difficult to come by, more so than in any other Final Fantasy aside from 8. Like, mobs hardly drop gil unless they're like, you're fighting the Imperials or whatever. And dropping gil makes story narrative sense there. And really the only way to get mass amounts of gil is to sell everything you own constantly. Every time you go to a new world and you visit a new shop, you will sell every goddamn thing you have. You'll basically be a walking pawn shop by the end of the game with how much crap you're gonna sell. Every bit of currency you spend in this game matters, from license points to gil. But again, that doesn't take away the amount of choices you can make with this license board. And I haven't even discussed a dozen jobs you have at your disposal, which further hammer in the idea of customization. But not only that, it'll also allow each party member to have their own distinct mechanical personality. You can just let your imagination run rampant, just thinking of all the crazy builds you can come up with. Of course, you'll want to have stats into consideration when you're coming up with these builds, but nothing says you have to. You don't need to think about magic stats, what character has the best health and physical strength or whatever. Everything is really up to you. I mean, if you're feeling brave, nothing's stopping you from making Bosch a white mage or Pinello a knight. I specifically think making Pinello a knight is funny because you get to watch her wield this giant fucking sword and it's hilarious. It all comes down to preference here. No single character is relegated to any class or anything in general. You're the one in charge of how each one progresses throughout the game. But of course, a fantastic progression system means fuck all if you can't complement them with fun gameplay mechanics. Luckily, Final Fantasy XII steadily avoids this would-be trap by implementing the Gambit system, one of the most unique features this game has to offer. And it's a pretty damn robust system too, even if it's not without its shortcomings. For instance, one of the Gambit system's finest qualities is simultaneously a detriment. There are a shit and fuck ton of parameters to choose from, and believe me when I say that they get very specific, and I mean comically specific, to the point where they fit like every single situation you can imagine. There is a gambit for just about any scenario you can think of in your head, to the point where some of them are just straight up redundant. Like, what difference does it make if I set Kira to a party member that has less than 50% HP versus one that has less than 40% HP? It doesn't make much of a difference, and I don't see the reason why you need to have both. I can target enemies that are flying, enemies that have protect cast onto them, and allies that are inflicted with any status ailment in the game. Cool. But again, there's just way too many, and I wouldn't complain except for the fact that you have to pay for them. A lot of the parameters fall under that category too. There's no doubt an abundance of useful ones, but so many of them just had me sitting there like, when the fuck am I ever gonna need this? I appreciate the amount of effort that was put into the system, but come on. I will say that the paywall is pretty minimal, yes, but again, it's a paywall, and having a paywall for something like that is kind of lame. And with that nitpick out of the way, we can now move on to everything that makes this Gambit system so surprisingly fantastic. Obviously, you always have the option to input commands directly yourself, but why not play with this Gambit system? It's incredibly fun. And if you do so choose to have Gambits disabled throughout your playthrough, you will be missing out on everything that makes the Gambit system work so well. Alongside the ability to customize how your party members evolve, you'll have the ability to dictate how they interact with their environment through these parameters that can be set up in a prioritized order. You can enable every party member to enact a certain command whenever the proper conditions are met. But with the way you can order them in a prioritized fashion, a character's action will be interrupted with the one you placed higher on the list given its perceived significance. Say a character is queued up with Thundaga, then suddenly an ally's HP falls below 50%. That character will then replace that Thundaga with a Cura, thus curing your party member and cancelling out the Thundaga. This brings me back to earlier in the video where I debunked the whole FF12 plays itself argument, and now allow me to debunk it even further. Don't get me wrong, the queue-in feature I just mentioned did lead to some frustrating moments, but maybe that was just because the Gambit setup I had for whatever situation I was in wasn't optimal enough. What I'm trying to say is that updating your Gambits to suit a particular combat scenario is crucial if you want to survive with minimal casualties, and minimal mana spent. I would need multiple hands, like I'm Goro from Mortal Kombat, in order to count the amount of times I got fucked up in a combat scenario, changed up my Gambits, swapped some shit around, put some new spells here, put some new spells there, and then went out and absolutely crushed the competition. It happened so many times, I can't even begin to describe. I can't even begin to tally it up. And this is why I urge you to actually utilize the Gambit system over not using it, because when you execute the perfect setup, you'll fucking know it. And believe me when I say that it's nothing short of satisfying. Not gonna lie, it sometimes made me feel like a football coach or something. And the Gambit system was my playbook, where I would constantly try to draw up the perfect plays to counter whatever it was my opponent had to offer. Was that a bad analogy? Probably. Did I make it simply because the NFL season had just started and it's on my mind? Probably. Go G-Men, by the way. We're definitely not going 1-16. Anyway, with mechanics as strong as these, you'll need a good, solid lineup of enemies to fight if you want to make the most of them. Unfortunately, like most Final Fantasy titles, you won't find such enemies throughout the main story. There are exceptions, but the best of what FF12 has to offer lie within this entry's big, landmark minigame, the hunts. To me, as well as most of the people who've played FF12, the hunts are the game's bread and butter. It's the soul of the title. It's the main reason why you should play it to begin with. Okay, that was clearly overzealous of me, but regardless, the hunts are one of the best aspects of the game. Well over 40 fights have become increasingly more challenging with massively varying strategies you'll need to employ in order to knock them all down. The first few are pretty standard, but once you start knocking some down and getting down the hunts list, you'll find some that are pretty damn challenging and thus very, very satisfying. They will test your foresight and your knowledge of the gambit system and your general skills in ways you didn't think were possible. And best of all, they're just incredibly fun. And I don't remember any of them feeling particularly unfair or monotonous. Except for, well, that one. Yeah. That hunt. The one that is one of the most notorious bosses in Final Fantasy history. That one. I believe it starts with the Y. I'll fight it one day. I will fight it one day. Once I get the confidence and the skill necessary, I will fight it. And it will be mine. And I will brag to my neighbors like they give a shit. And I totally won't look like I'm on crack. But yeah, I'll fight them at one point. And by I will fight them, I mean I won't. Because I'm a bitch. Moving on. There's also some nice bits of storytelling to go along with the hunts as well, with the added bonus of having massive variety in terms of mechanics and visual flair. Quest-wise, they range from the simplistic, this thing's been bothering me, go kill it. Like it's a fucking pest, get rid of it please. To hunts involving personal dilemmas, to hunts that greatly expand the already complex lore behind this world of Ivalice. As if the world of this game didn't feel lived in enough already, we have the hunts to thank for giving it the extra jolt it honestly didn't even need, because world building, even disregarding the hunts, is ridiculously impressive. The hunts just provide us with additional insight onto the everyday lives of your average everyday people. People who have their own occupations, their own desires, their own, again, personal dilemmas, be they insignificant or the complete opposite. And it all feels so incredibly organic. Ivalice is definitely the most richly detailed world in Final Fantasy. Hell, it's one of the most in any video game that I have ever played. I feel like I've repeated that sentiment a lot across my numerous videos on this series. Like, I think I said it for FF9. I think I made that exact same statement for FF9. I think I made it for FF7 too. I feel like I've said this like every single video, like every past and Final Fantasy review I've done. This has the best world building. This has the best world building. Oh, this has the... Actually, fuck all that shit. Because FF12 does indeed have the best set-in-stone world building of any Final Fantasy. And that is opinion I will have set in stone. I will die on that hill if I say that again for fuck FF13 or 15 or something. Then you can bust into my house and karate chop me until my skull gets split in half. Because I'll sound like a fucking idiot. Even when you're running around Rabanastre for the first time within the game's opening hour, the amount of realism they caked into the game's setting is immediately tangible. It very much resembles your average bustling town square, from the swarms of commoners and merchants, to the various conversations you can have with NPCs, to even the fucking music. It just screams peaceful medieval town directly into your ear. Like, take a listen real quick. Tell me this doesn't sound like the calmest, like, most urban shit ever. But what I said just now only scratches the surface of the game's world-building mechanics. From there, it only gets more and more detailed. And when I say that, I'm not talking about the game in its entirety. I'm still primarily focusing on Rabanastre. Rabanastre itself supplies itself with so much visual storytelling, it's actually insane. For instance, Rabanastre has an underground district known as the Low Town, where the shadier folks of the region tend to reside, a slum, if you will. The comparatively dim lighting, the claustrophobic layout, and the strange music tells us this on its own. Not to mention that this area shares space with the literal sewer of the city. But then you return to the main city streets and everything feels a little more upbeat this time around. This alone is able to provide us with a clearer perspective as to how social classes work in this place, and how realistically the main principles of stratification were portrayed. It all just functions so much like your typical city. And that's not even getting into the nitty-gritty of your average NPC interaction, where we're able to view the personalized struggles of the individual, as well as their hobbies, aspirations, and the like. Now compare this to the Imperial City Arcades, where we really begin to see these ideas of social hierarchy translated much more strongly. Here in Arcades, that social triangle is portrayed in a much more explicit manner, where we can see at the lower levels of the city, we have the slum to end all slums. It's immediately hammered in to how fucking poor everyone in part of town is. And I'm not even just talking about like whatever exposition there is in the dialogue and cutscenes or whatever. I mean like just like straight up visual storytelling. Like no one in this goddamn city has a shirt on. They're all wearing tattered clothes. All the chests have either straight up rust or like pocketfuls of Jill. I'm talking like 12, 15 Jill. Can't even buy a fucking sandwich with that money. And again, it all helps to further establish these ideals of a social hierarchy and how they function in real life. Albeit it's in a more video gamey way, but it's still very realistic nonetheless. And then you rise up from the shit stain of the slums all the way to the Imperial capital, where everything is noticeably more polished, more aristocratic, more indulgent as well, to the point where the NPC interactions are incredibly self-indulgent. Like, they're, like, worried, the things they worry about are, like, completely innocuous compared to what the people you just talked to down below. Like, the people down below, they get by through rumors and fights and shit. Like, that place is fucked. And then you go to the Imperial capital, and then they're just like talking about, oh no, what am I gonna get for my daughter's wedding? And oh no, I'm not as rich as this guy. Oh no. Simply put, this game does a remarkable job in establishing a world that's trapped beneath the heels of an oppressive empire that's been swallowed whole by war. I could list more and more details, but really the main selling point of FF12's world building, for me at least, is just the sheer diversity of it all. Not just in terms of landscape or architecture, but primarily in terms of culture. Ivalice borrows from a wide variety of European cultures, such as Scottish, Greek, Irish, etc., albeit they're distilled in a way that gives Ivalice its own sense of identity, while still feeling like an organic, interconnected world similar to our very own. Everything from the way they talk, dress, act, fuck, it's all indicative of a world that is very much caked in reality and operates much like a realistic world. It all helps personify a world built around various cultures, each with their own lore reasons for not only existing, but how they exist, why they exist, and whether or not they coexist with the world or not. Again, it feels like our world, and it's impressive. Again, it feels like our world, and I've yet to play another Final Fantasy world building anywhere as intricate or realistic as this. It's lively, it's huge, it's all connected, both in terms of gameplay and story as well. I wonder over how the world building was able to affect the story in a positive way, but unfortunately the sheer scale of Ivalice and its sprawling interconnectivity posed a major detriment on the game's exploration and general traversal. To put things simply, most of the open world in this game is simply too big. And with the general slowness of the game, it makes traversing these massive landscapes rather tedious after a solid few minutes. Having a new chunk of mobs to fight is always a pleasure to have, but once you have all the fun you could possibly have with them, you'll start to realize you're only a quarter of the way to your destination, and you have to fight the same enemies again and again and again for God only knows how long. And this isn't even the worst part, because mind you, dungeons operate in the exact same fashion, except with dungeons, you have shit like puzzles to worry about. So yeah, let's just throw that shit in the mix, and everything becomes a lot more arduous to put up with. The Still Shrine of Miriam was by far the biggest offender to me. Like, yeah, let's go unlock some doors, turn 3 different statues so they're all facing the Colossus, just to make some decent progress. It's just not very fun, and I got bored with it rather quickly. And I think I can say something similar to the rest of the dungeons because, again, they stretch these things way too goddamn thin. I enjoy the lore and everything they offer, but no amount of intrigue and historical context is gonna negate the fact that these dungeons are repetitive, plotted nightmares to get through. Pharos is also exemplative of this issue as well, but to make matters even worse here, there's a section where you have to hit the correct color-coded switch, with no real context clues as to which one you're supposed to hit. It's really picking out of a hat, and if you make the wrong selection twice, you get sent into a near impossible brawl with zombies and shit. These dungeons are not good. I fucking hate them. Maybe not hate, but I straight up don't like them at all. But credit where credit is due, it is impressive how they were able to design these worlds and put them onto a single PlayStation 2 disc. Yes, a game as large as this was on a PlayStation 2 disc. One PlayStation 2 disc. And that's not even counting the fact that FMVs are a lot more frequent in this game, and they're a lot more cinematic and detailed. Like, look at this shit. Holy hell, this game really pushed a PlayStation 2 to its breaking point. I'm surprised, like, there's been, like, no report that PlayStation 2 is blowing up in the process of trying to run some of these FMVs, or some of these open worlds. I can't imagine that it instantly becomes a fucking toaster, though. Like, you touch that shit and your hand, like, immediately catches fire. And there is so much excess in these worlds and FMVs that it comes at the expense of certain qualities being less than perfect compared to previous entries. Much like Final Fantasy IX, another title that came out right on the heels of the next console generation, the sheer scope of the game's ambition ended up creating some fallbacks that the game wouldn't have suffered otherwise. Yes, this game jam-packed so much into a single PS2 disc that the voiceovers suffered for it. Not in terms of acting, god no. This has some of the best voice acting in this series, and I love how they each have each character has like a theater-esque flair to them. It's like I'm watching a play. So yeah, the voice acting, the voice performances are top-notch. But the audio-related issues stem from... well, I'll have you take a listen for yourself.
Now there is the Bosch that I remember.
Then will you fight again at my side?
His word alone convinces me of nothing.
I'd take his word over that of a mouthpiece Marquis.
Then you name Rex liar with him.
My brother was no liar!
Yeah, the audio is scuffed, and it's immediately noticeable and immediately jarring. Like, the mics on this game straight up sound worse than mine, and this is a cheap-ass mic I've got. The characters will often sound as if they're speaking through the microphone from a McDonald's drive-thru. It's weird, but to be honest, I actually got used to it fairly quickly. No, that's not me saying that I warmed up to it and now I think that it sounds good. It's me saying that while it is a genuine issue, it's not the end of the world or anything like that. Speaking of the end of the world, I think now would be a good time to finally delve into the narrative of Final Fantasy XII. For all of its highlights, but also its many, many faults. Not that its faults are particularly detrimental or anything, but again, its highlights are not very noteworthy either. I mean, they are, but when you compare the story to, let's say, 7 or 9 or 10, it does fall short a little bit. Yeah, Final Fantasy XII's narrative kind of sits in this weird middle ground, where it's got some interesting ideas here and there, but with too many of them being left on the cutting room floor. It feels big and grand, while simultaneously feeling kind of empty. And I think the reason for the story feeling this way was because of its rather lackluster sense of progression. It's also just not paced very well either. Many of Final Fantasy XII's plot points revolve around gathering various items while political power plays are happening in the background. And I think that's what scared a lot of players away from this entry. It's very laser focused on its political narratives, and a lot of the things fans typically look for in a Final Fantasy had mostly been cast to the wayside. But if you were to ask me, I would tell you that the political angle of Final Fantasy XII's story is rather interesting. There's a ton of intrigue between the two clashing empires, as they are not only trying to tiptoe their way around the massive oil field with lit matches in their hands, so to speak, but in the case of the Arcadian Empire, they have to think about what's best for their future in preserving the Solidor family. The early hours of the game were able to establish this sense of escalated tension that felt really gripping but also really organic as well. These two empires are teetering on the edge of a full-scale war, and you can truly get a feel for everything that's at stake here. The Solidor family, Rosaria, the fate of the lands between the empires, whether or not our party has a chance at stopping it, etc. They did such a fantastic job at portraying the real, authentic politics of an international conflict. War doesn't always have to come down to whoever is a bigger and stronger nation and who has the most well-trained soldiers, who has the most money and shit like that. It's just about as much as things like deterrence, negotiation, spying, manipulating the public, and staging coups against your ruling father. Those last 2 points are where Vayne Solidor really makes his presence as the game's main antagonist known. And it's precisely at this moment, when he makes himself known, where the story starts to slam its foot on the brakes. Because from this point forward, not a whole lot of anything interesting happens, despite there being such a long time between this point and the final boss. And most of it happens toward the very end of the game, like I mean the tail fucking end of the game. We learn that Cid's got this little ghost buddy who's apparently the traitor of an all-powerful species of mysterious gods. That's cool, I guess. Yeah, this plot point kinda came and went in my mind. The game didn't allow it to marinate enough to warrant any personal investment into it. I won't sit here and act like it comes out of nowhere or anything, because there is a good amount of foreshadowing used throughout, but let's be real here, the game makes everything regarding Venat and the Ikuria in general way too ambiguous. We do know that they had established control over the Humes for many years through the use of nethicite cut fresh from the Sun Crest, but then the party destroys the Sun Crest. And what is a group of all-powerful ghostly gods left to do? Well, the answer is fucking nothing. Can't they just rebuild the Sun Crest or descend from their thrones and control humanity through sheer force? Are they even all-powerful gods at all? Couldn't the party have just fought them all and dealt with them for good? I don't fucking know, man. This whole aspect of the story felt super bare bones. Almost as there were supposed to be more pieces of this puzzle, but the writers just ran out of time. I do appreciate the subtle aspects these guys brought to the table, like using projected images of the dead to manipulate others, but I feel like the side of the narrative could have been a little more upfront. Or maybe I'm just missing some very important detail and I sound really stupid or something. Something I am absolutely certain about, however, is how badly the structure falls apart in the second half of the game. Instead of having the plot unfold in an engaging way, the game instead throws us through a series of fetch quests that become increasingly tiresome to slog through. This game introduces so many unique narrative ideas, but they ended up falling through the cracks because the game is just way too focused on sending us through these really ridiculous, again, fetch quests, where I have to get this stone, then I have to get this sword to break another stone, and it just becomes really goddamn tiring. And seriously though, you can spend upwards of 2 hours playing this game without encountering a single line of dialogue. It's a good story that's not told very well. And by far the biggest casualty that came as a result of this lackluster storytelling were the characters. While no character in this game is legitimately terrible or even bad, they do have a collective lack of development that gets more and more egregious as the game goes on. The number of character dynamics also see a severe limitation, as the party hardly interacts with each other outside of the really significant story moments. Hell, in a lot of the game's major cutscenes, it'll involve 1, 2, maybe 3 of your party members conversing, while the rest are just standing around with dumb looks on their faces. And the characters in question are usually Ash, Bosch, or Balthier. Ash obviously because she's the most important and quintessential character of the game. The two former characters mostly speak about the plot because the plot has quite a bit to do with them, Ash being the queen of the fallen Dalmascan kingdom, while Bosch being the once powerful knight that was set up by his brother, who killed the previous king of Dalmasca. With the two formers having actually thoughtful input on the subject at hand, while the latter tosses quips around like your balding uncle does at the family barbecue. Meanwhile, Vaughn, Fran, and especially fucking Pinello provide basically zero input throughout a vast majority of the story. Getting back to the lack in character dynamics, the lack of character dynamics becomes especially more annoying when it really starts to affect the plot and makes certain aspects of said plot rather confusing. The most notable example I can think of involves Balthier, Vaughn, and the former's airship, the Straw. The game obviously sets up a sort of teacher-student dynamic between Balthier and Vaughn, only to do absolutely nothing with it. So to see Vaughn fly the airship through a fucking battlefield just comes across as jarring. He didn't learn anything. Balthier didn't hand him the Airships for Dummies guide manual, so what the fuck does Vaughn know about flying an airship? Absolutely nothing. How is he doing this? I don't know. Plot convenience, I guess. This may come across as a nitpick, but to me, it just goes to show how much the party lacked any real dynamics between each other. It gets worse too, mind you, because some characters have an established dynamic with only one character. Fran, for instance, has a nice ambiguously romantic relationship with Balthier, but nothing really beyond that. I mean, there was this little itty-bitty crumb-sized arc she had with her race. I can't even remember the fucking name of them because they just did nothing with this aspect of the story. And again, they spend like up to like 30 minutes with Fran's backstory, and they don't touch upon it at all like afterward. It's just, dude, they have the ingredients, but they did nothing with it, man. Anyway, Fran will inject some important context into a conversation whenever need be, but other than that, nah man, she stays dead fucking silent. And then there's Penelo. Whoo boy, Penelo. What a character she is. If there were any other character that better epitomized the cleany girl who only exists to be the male's motivation, seriously, what the hell does this character even do? Other than ask basic questions for the sole purpose of setting up an exposition dump, of course. I mean, she's got to have at least some dialogue that contributes to the narrative, right? Even if it just reiterates what we can already observe for ourselves. I mean, in all fairness, she has a decent enough relationship with Larsa, but aside from that, this girl purely exists as a party member because Vaughn. Vaughn's here, so she's here. But I can't be too mad at her, I guess. She served her role as a white mage pretty well, and she came in the clutch on numerous occasions. She is just an unbelievably weak addition to this story. Speaking of Vaughn, let's just say that he's a very conflicting character for me personally as well. It's weird too, because his character's been so badly misconstrued by fans, but at the same time, the usual complaints surrounding him aren't 100% wrong either. Let's get one thing out of the way though. His role as the main protagonist of the game is completely baffling. Not because this role is completely incongruous and he feels out of place as the main character, but because I don't know whether or not he fulfills that role in a way I can particularly jive with. I, again, have very conflicting thoughts with this fucking character, and I'll explain those thoughts because that's why you clicked on this video, or at least I assume that's the reason. Stalin aside, his role as a thematic crux of the story is 100% clear and obvious, and perfect. He truly and honestly embodies everything Final Fantasy XII sought to accomplish with its themes. These ideals of the pointlessness of vengeance, the ability to move on from tragedies of the past, etc., resonate the strongest with Vaughn. Vaughn has so many thematically potent moments that it baffles me how anyone could label him as useless. That scene where he admits to Ash that his dream of becoming a sky pirate was just a mask to hide his inner depression was incredibly strong. But for now, I'll take a slight detour from this point to squeeze in a bit of Ash character analysis action, since the two share similar motives and such. Much like Vaughn losing his brother, Rex, the Empire, Ash loses her husband and King of Damaska as well. And over the course of the game, the two would take notice to a projection of Ash's husband as a means to coerce them into getting exact revenge. Initially, I was very confused as to how Vaughn was able to see this ghost guy while no other party member was able to, and I think a lot of people can share that same sentiment. But it didn't take long until it was obvious that their shared experiences over losing a family member to war granted Vaughn the ability to see the ghost of the late Dalmascan king. And it was through these shared experiences that Vaughn and Ash were able to bond with each other and discuss their dilemmas regarding vengeance. Would destroying the Empire bring those lost souls peace, or would peace bring them peace? Down the road, their ideals would be challenged through a variety of resolve tests, such as the acquisition of tempting power, the knowledge of said powers, and of course, the ghost of her husband, attempting to lead her down a path of exact revenge. Ash would receive these powers and learn a great deal of her ancestral history as a bonus, but in her mind, the focus is primarily on whether or not she's doing the right thing preserving the honor of Damaska and its late king. But through the sheer strength of will they learned over the course of their journey, and their remembrance of what's important, Ash and Vaughn cast away their vengeance for good, in a very rousing scene that comes right before a piss-easy boss fight. What Vaughn says here is actually extremely crucial for personifying these themes, as it gets across everything it needs to and concludes his character arc with just a few simple words. So with everything I had just said in mind, you may be asking yourself, okay, Vaughn seems like a perfectly serviceable protagonist, so where the hell does all this strife come from? And to answer that question, Vaughn's role as a protagonist is conflicting because while he serves a thematic purpose nicely, his presence in the overarching plot couldn't be any more uninvolved. Given that he was chosen to represent FF12 in Dissidia, and given that he's the only character you control outside of gameplay sections, we have to assume that he is indeed the leading man in this story. But this choice feels extremely odd, since the actual narrative hardly revolves around him at all. I mean, sure, his life was fucked over by the Empire and shit, but that's about it. I mean, the whole reason he's even in the party to begin with was because he got swept up into Balthira's plot while trying to steal some treasure. If anything, the true protagonist of Final Fantasy XII is Ash. It's her kingdom she's taken back. Everything in the plot hinges on her decisions. It's her family's history we're constantly being told. Ash is a true, bona fide protagonist of Final Fantasy XII. She's also the only character in this game that I feel has a complete character arc that feels full and fleshed out from start to finish. Yeah, there's another issue I have with the story. The character arcs in Final Fantasy XII don't feel as particularly fleshed out as I would like them to be, and some of them just straight up feel neglected. I will say they're not as bad as Final Fantasy XII's outright complete fucking neglect of anyone who's not Squall or Rinoa, but most of the character development in Final Fantasy XII is rather lackluster, again, for lack of a better word. And it's lacking the same level of emotional investment that I find in other Final Fantasies, because without this same level of emotional investment, I can't feel as connected to the story or its characters as I would like to be, and that's a real shame, because there is a lot of potential here, and a lot of really fucking good setups that could have led to some very, very good character arcs had they actually bothered to expand upon them. I mean, yeah, the surrounding narrative of this game is intriguing and mostly well told, barring the pacing problems, but if you're lacking the strong character arcs to bring everything home, it results in a very empty feeling once the game is actually finished. Whatever arcs there are receive very shaky conclusions that feel too rushed without any real build-up to them. And yes, despite what I said earlier, Vaughn is also guilty of this, because the scenes that I did praise with him are really the only bits of development that he gets, because outside of those scenes I discussed, he really doesn't really do much, really. His speech about moving on from his brother's murder is nice, but there's really not much before or beyond that. Once Gabranth is beaten by Vayne, and he's on his deathbed, Vaughn doesn't exchange any sort of passing words with him. No, I forgive you for killing my bro, or anything of the sort. He just runs off toward Vayne, almost as if Gabranth wasn't even there. Even the dynamic between Balthier and his father Cid felt really bare bones. Not exactly terrible or anything, but I feel like there just could have been more. You don't have to constantly hit the player over the head with details, as too much exposition is always a bad thing. But don't give us a good setup, then leave us out to dry with little to no elaboration followed up, and have a conclusion that's so quick and hastily put together that it just ends up feeling empty. Because that's pretty much how every character arc operates in this game. How every single one operates besides Ash's, and maybe Bosch's if I'm feeling generous, and fuck, I'll throw Larsa a bone in this case. But aside from that, the characters of Final Fantasy XII ultimately felt half-baked. Not bad, but not exactly peaches and cream either. One last bit of praise I'd like to extend before closing out this review is the way the game navigates these gray area ideals of wrong versus right were very well executed. It's very much grounded in reality, and that's something I can appreciate. The hero's journey and explicit good conquers explicit bad tropes are nice, but every once in a while, it's great we get a story where there really is no right or wrong in what the antagonists or even the protagonists are doing. This is best exemplified through Vayne's actions, where his goal is a very admirable one. He seeks to pry power from the hands of the Ikuria and give it back to humanity. He wants humans to decide their own destiny, not have it be controlled by these floating ghost things. But I shouldn't even have to tell you that his execution was at least a teensy bit flawed. He's a total warmonger, and his conquest resulted in the deaths of millions. But hey, all a means to an end, right? This is also reflected within Ash's actions as well, as it ties back into the things I mentioned earlier, where she not only has what's best for the people of Ivalice in mind, but she's also thinking about the best way to honor Rassler. Getting back to Vayne, I think he is an overall pretty interesting antagonist. Gotta say, it's a bit weird seeing people accusing him of being weak or badly written. What, because he isn't yet another villain with the "I want to destroy the world until the hero beats my ass, and now I finally see the value in life" cliche? Please, more subtlety and nuance is welcomed in my house, thank you very much. Anyway, Vayne is very much the best example of the realistic bad guy in Final Fantasy. He puts on a caring facade to sway public opinion. He uses tactical power plays and deterrence, instead of outright blowing everything in his path to smithereens. He orders the executions of his family members to acquire more power, so on and so forth. All this and more work to embody the perfect, realistically portrayed antagonist. I just love how the story works with a moral compass that is more complex than your average FF title. Because at the end of the day, this is a story about war and the sheer politics behind it all. It's not your average everyday story of good conquering evil where the good guys are morally perfect and the bad guys just want to watch the world suffer. Those stories do have merit, but there's nothing wrong with a more grounded and down-to-earth story from time to time. I just wish the characters were given a bit more development and that the pacing didn't crater itself into the floor every 2 hours. Because if it weren't for those two issues, Final Fantasy XII would have one of the strongest narratives in the franchise. But as it stands right now, the narrative of Final Fantasy XII is a resounding good. And I think that word best summarizes the Final Fantasy XII experience as a whole. It's not perfect, but it is good. It's not amazing, it has its fair share of problems. Some of them can be easily swept under the rug, while others are more difficult to ignore. It is, however, a very strong title in a very strong franchise that has a host of unique ideas that no other entry had even bothered to tackle up until that point. The active battle system that favors positioning and forward thinking over quick reactions. The wide open world that has an endless pool of NPC interactions and exploration that favors player intent over set checkpoints and linearity. The story with morally gray characters and nuanced political intrigue over a group of buddies killing bluntly evil gods. Final Fantasy XII is, for better or for worse, different. It feels almost entirely unfamiliar, but that alone does not a bad game make. And it's just frustrating to see so many people going such great lengths to shit on this game for that reason, or for those same reasons, they just straight up ignore the game and pretend it doesn't exist. And that's a crying shame because, yeah, while this game feels largely unfamiliar from previous entries, that's exactly what makes it so special and what makes it worth playing. It's far from perfect, but if everything I've said so far has convinced you to try it, or at least retry it, then I fear you're missing out on a rather wonderful, albeit flawed experience. I'm feeling a solid 7 on Final Fantasy X. See you bitches later. It had just now occurred to me that I called Final Fantasy XII Final Fantasy X. I think something's wrong with my brain.